Chris mentioned I've been very active relating or involved in the COVID issue as the ranking member on Senate Homeland Security Committee. That means I oversee FEMA, and as all of you know, FEMA has been in charge with the federal response. It's been very difficult dealing with this administration, as you can imagine, given the fact the president doesn't seem to want to have a coordinated response nationally or a plan put forward. He's been pretty much deferring to all of the governors, including making governors compete with each other to try to get personal protection equipment, to get testing supplies, something that we should be doing in a coordinated national way to use the purchasing power of the federal government to have massive supplies available, as well as to use tools like the Defense Production Act, which allows the federal government to go to companies and require them to make critical life-saving supplies. It's not charity. They get paid for it. They get paid very well, and they know they have a long-term customer, not only during the crisis, but after the crisis, as we have to rebuild the strategic stockpiles of critical medical equipment necessary to get through what will be, unfortunately, a future pandemic, hopefully a long time down the road, but you never know. Pandemics have been with us throughout history. They're going to continue to be there, and we have to make sure we do a better job than we did in dealing with this pandemic. And particularly of concern of mine, as well as I think all of us, was the slow response coming from the president, who thought it was just going to miraculously disappear. It wouldn't impact the United States. And clearly others did not believe that. I didn't. I was very outspoken in January that this is a national health crisis and a threat coming from overseas and from China that we have to be prepared to deal with. And it took a while before we saw that kind of approach from the federal government. And time is of the essence when you're dealing with a virus. And if you let a virus get ahead of you, it's very difficult to catch up. So we have our hands full. We're going to continue to have our hands full, particularly as we're now opening up parts of the economy. I think we all agree we'd like to do that quickly, but we also all agree, I would hope, that we want to do it safely, that we've got to be as safe as possible as we open up the economy to make sure that employees are safe in the businesses that they work and customers are as safe as they possibly can be. And it's pretty difficult to open an economy and open businesses if people are not feeling comfortable and don't actually want to go to those businesses. It's not going to be successful. So we have to continue to focus on both the healthcare crisis as well as the economic crisis, but understand fundamentally it's a healthcare crisis first and foremost. Let me just touch the campaign again, then we'll open it up to questions that folks may have. Clearly, my Senate race is one of the highest profile races in the country, primarily stemming from the fact that Michigan is the key battleground state for the presidential race. I think it's impossible to be president of the United States if you don't win Michigan. It may not be a sufficient condition, but clearly it is a necessary condition, which is why Trump has been in this state a lot, especially lately. He was here last week. And if you recall, prior to the shutdown and the stay-at-home order, nearly every week for several weeks before that time, either Pence or Trump was here in Michigan. They're putting a lot of resources here. We have to all come together as Democrats and make sure that the state is a blue state, and we elect Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. But given the fact that we're a central state in the presidential race, that makes my Senate race high profile. I'm one of two Democrats in a state that Donald Trump won. And my seat is absolutely critical to hold if we have a shot to take back the Senate. And I would argue that the majority in the Senate in many ways is more important than the presidency. And all we have to do is look back to see President Obama and his presidency and how difficult it was for him having Mitch McConnell basically blocking so much of his initiatives, so many of his initiatives, including a Supreme Court justice, which is absolutely outrageous. So the majority of the Senate is critical. The good news is we have a real path. It's a very narrow path. We have to pick up 4 seats in order to be at 51. If we are only able to pick up 3 seats and the presidency, the vice president would break the tie and we'd still be in good shape. So what that means is that we have to hold a seat. And if Michigan is not held, the math works out very difficult. Is very difficult for us in order to have the majority. So we are putting together a very robust campaign. We want to be in all 83 counties. We're going to have a very aggressive absentee ballot program as well to make sure the Democrats are voting and voting in the comfort of their home. It's certainly unfortunate we have a president who has been attacking our vote by mail process, our no reason absentee, which a very strong majority of the people of Michigan wanted to see happen in 2018 when they voted for it. It's safe, it's secure, it makes it more convenient for folks to exercise their fundamental constitutional right. It's something President Trump has done nearly, I think, every election he votes by mail. So it's okay for him to vote by mail, but apparently not other citizens who want to exercise their right. Just another example of the hypocrisy that we see out of this administration. My opponent in this race supports Donald Trump 2,000%. He's very proud to say that, although now he's trying to talk out of both sides of his mouth. It's clear that Trump is fully supportive of him, just did a major email for him, national fundraiser. Trump Jr. did a video fundraiser for him, and I think Trump Jr. said that my opponent, Mr. James, I think it was the term, he understands the agenda and he will fully implement the Trump agenda. So it's very clear as to where my opponent is coming from. We also have Betsy DeVos and her family who are investing in a super PAC to come against me. They've already put in roughly $1 million, and I'm sure that's just a down payment of what's going to be continuing funding, because they know how important this seat is and how important Michigan is into national politics. So I'm confident we're going to win. I've won tough races before. 2014, I was the only new Democrat elected in the US Senate in 2014. And Michigan went red that year, if you recall. Michigan reelected Snyder and Republican AG, Republican Secretary of State. They picked up seats in the state house and in the state Senate, and I was still able to win. And I expect that we're going to be running a very strong campaign and we're going to win again this year. But I can't do it without all of your help. We look forward to working with you. I've got folks from my campaign staff on the call here with us here today who stand ready to work with each and every one of you. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to folks, Satish or Chris, whoever is moderating this.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. Let me, initially I mentioned, you were not able to hear, but thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to connect with you in this town hall. So really appreciate it. My name is Satish Ramade. I'm co-chair with Eli Nathans, and Eli and I will moderate this town hall together. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are expecting this to last about an hour, and we have pre-submitted questions from you, and we will start with those questions first, and then depending on the time left, we will use Q&A feature of the Zoom meeting to ask more questions. That said, let me bring Eli to the panelists so that he and I can moderate this together. Okay. So as Eli,
hi Eli.
Hello, Senator Peters.
So let me start with the first question, Senator Peters. So what can Democrats in Congress and their supporters in the country do to ensure that federal government provides large-scale assistance to state governments to enable them to maintain vital state functions and to assist people who have lost their jobs as a result of pandemic, despite the steep decline in state revenues from tax collection?
Yes, the decline in state revenues is dramatic. Here in Michigan, it'll be in the billions of dollars, and we're seeing that across the country as a result of the crisis. We've got revenues dropping dramatically in the states, and yet the services that states and local governments need to provide to their citizens continue, and in some ways have increased. We as Democrats have always understood that we need to provide help to state and local governments to get through this crisis. In the first CARES Act, we did put resources in to help states. We knew at the time that it would likely be insufficient and we would need to come back and do more as we were dealing with many aspects of it. Certainly that has come to pass. I will say, unfortunately, Republicans in the Congress have pushed back very aggressively and do not believe the federal government should be helping state and local governments. We tried to get a provision in the, after the CARES Act, we had the next bill which dealt with putting additional resources into the Paycheck Protection Plan for small businesses. It also provided additional money for testing and healthcare services. The Republicans said they would not, in the Senate, would not go for any money for state and local governments. They've still pretty much held to that position now that the House has voted, and I think everybody here on the Zoom realizes that the House of Representatives and the Democrats there put in close to $1 trillion to help governments across the country. It is now before the Senate. We have Mitch McConnell that says he's not interested in taking up a package anytime soon. We're continuing to press him that we need to continue to provide support to get through the crisis. State and local governments are key to that. Also, I think you're going to need some more support for our small businesses who have been receiving support, but are without question the engine of growth. And the Paycheck Protection Plan allows them to stay in business and keep their employees on the payroll, which is important. But as we start reopening an economy, if you lose most of your small businesses, it's going to be really difficult to get the economy up and running going forward. The other issue that we want to make sure is taking care of our families, that they get the money that they need to keep food on the table and a roof over their head. That's why in the CARES Act, we had an expansion of the unemployment compensation program. In fact, the Pandemic Assistance Act that really increased the eligibility for unemployment insurance is the bill that I wrote. It's my bill. I wrote it, a lot of it related to the work I do on FEMA. And it's similar to what we do if a hurricane hits an area. A hurricane comes in, literally people's jobs are blown away. They need to have access to unemployment, and that means not just folks traditionally in unemployment insurance, but also small business owners, people in the gig economy, independent contractors. Think of people who are Uber drivers, folks like that who suddenly don't have an income anymore. And that was put forward in the CARES Act. That goes through the end of July, and I think we're going to have to revisit whether or not we're going to have to continue some of those programs going forward. But it is the focus of the Democratic caucus to continue to do that, to pick up on where the House was in putting together their bill and try to negotiate with Republicans to make sure that we're helping everyday people get through this crisis. And in the process of helping everyday people get through it also means their state and local governments and the vital services they provide, like first responders, can continue to be provided ahead. So it's an ongoing battle, and the fact that we're having such a difficult time in the Senate goes back to what I mentioned in my opening comments. That's why we have to win the majority in the Senate. It is just so critical that we win this year.
Oh, that's true. So just kind of mention, Eli and I will alternate questions. And then we will monitor Q&A feature of Zoom meeting. So please feel free to use Q&A Zoom meeting feature. However, it will really depends on if we have the time left after going through the pre-submitted question. So Senator, the next one is related to universal health care. The question is as follows: doesn't the pandemic illustrate the value of universal health care? What is your plan for ensuring expanding access to healthcare within the framework of Affordable Care Act? It's a follow-up to that. Within the framework of the Affordable Care Act, how can we reduce the size of premiums and also large deductible that often prevent people who have insurance from using it?
Yes, I mean, I believe that healthcare is a right, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, have access to quality, affordable healthcare. The affordable healthcare was a major step forward, as I think everybody here on the Zoom realizes. But we still can go further. We still have folks who are uninsured, and we still have to deal with the rising cost of healthcare that continues to increase at a pace that's unsustainable. We have right now been fighting defense, where the Republicans and Donald Trump basically want to undermine the Affordable Care Act and go back to the bad old days where people were denied insurance if they had pre-existing conditions. If you were a woman, you would pay higher premiums than other folks because that was considered a pre-existing condition. We can't go back to that. But as we know, the Trump administration right now has a lawsuit before the courts to try to undermine all of the Affordable Care Act And so we're going to continue to stand firm. The great thing about the Affordable Care Act from a political standpoint is that more and more people realize how important it is and how we have to continue to expand it. Certainly to the question about the pandemic, there's no question in my mind now that we understand how important it is for folks to have quality health care. It's why I've been pushing this administration to reopen the enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act during the pandemic. Right now, you have open enrollment towards the end of the year. Once a year, you can get into the Affordable Care Act. But it seems to me it makes perfect sense. It is the right thing to do, that when we are in the middle of a pandemic, the enrollment period should open. So anybody who wants to get into the Affordable Care Act to get the health care that they need for themselves and for their families would have an opportunity to get into it. Unfortunately, the Trump administration continues to push back and will not allow the ACA to be opened up for folks to get the health care coverage they get. And certainly people are very concerned should they get COVID-19 and find themselves in the hospital. It's a very expensive proposition. People need and must have health care to get through this. And so we want to continue to fund that. Certainly I'm committed when we take the majority to continue to expand on the good work of the Affordable Care Act. And I think as we continue to expand the Affordable Care Act and find ways to continue to improve it, you're going to continue to get greater and greater public support. I've always found the best way to move the needle on healthcare is to prove to people that it actually can work and that new innovative policies are good for them. And then you get very strong popular support. We're in that position now with the Affordable Care Act. It's more popular than it's ever been. And we got to build on that success and continue to move forward to make sure, back to what I said, that everybody in this country has access to quality, affordable healthcare. Everybody.
It's amazing that nothing, the logical thing makes sense on the other side. And Eli, I have the next set of questions to ask. Go ahead.
Senator Peters, as you know, these are questions based on suggestions we received from WCDP members. So next question concerns President Trump's recent attempts to, it seems, break down the rule of law. How can Congress address the various ways in which President Trump and his administration are undermining the rule of law, including most recently the attempt to dismiss the conviction of Michael Flynn and the dismissal of several inspectors general and acting inspectors general from key departments in the administration? It seems to prevent the enforcement of the law when President Trump and his close associates try to violate it. What can Congress do?
Well, the way for Congress to really deal with it is we have to have a majority in the Congress. Many of our reform efforts would be blocked, as all of you know, by the Republicans in the Senate. We have not been able to get Republican support to push back, for example, on the IG firings. Those are unacceptable. The IGs, the Inspector Generals, are the main watchdog for federal government to make sure that things are being done legally and that you minimize fraud and waste and abuse and all the things that can go on. It is within my committee's jurisdiction. I mentioned the Homeland Security. It's the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. We're the top oversight committee for the US Senate. We interact with the IG community on a regular basis. We expect them to be independent and to have the president basically fire folks and then put in people who he thinks are going to be favorable to him. I'll tell you the recent IG who I talked to was just appointed. He was under some pressure when he was in the General Accountability Office to be fired. And thought that when I asked him, did you think that was inappropriate when you're in the middle of an investigation to be fired? He said, yes, absolutely. Oh, that's inappropriate. I said, so you were part of legal counsel for President Trump when he fired IGs. What advice did you give him as the attorney? And he refused to answer. But the fact that he was then appointed by President Trump tells me he did give an answer to President Trump that was different than what he told me in terms that it's simply unacceptable to fire an attorney general or an IG who's in the middle of the investigation. We're in the process now of trying to strengthen legislation to insulate IGs from that kind of political pressure. We're working on a number of ideas. I will need to have Republican support for that to get it through the Senate. I'm not overly optimistic that that's going to happen, given what we're dealing with right now. But I think we have to put those proposals forward, and then we have to let the American people know that when we are in the majority, we will adopt those. But then you also have to have a president that will sign it into law. And right now we don't have that. So you've got to have a president as well. That's the way our system works. It's the majority of the House, majority in the Senate, and a president that signs. So you've got to have the levers of power. This is just an unprecedented time because we've always had presidents in the past, whatever you like their politics or not. Most of them, the vast majority of them, had some respect for the institutions themselves and common decency. We don't see that now in this president. So some of the checks that are necessary are clearly have to be strengthened. Where they were, we kind of relied on presidents to do the right thing. We can't rely on this president to do the right thing. And we're going to have to, when we have the majority, make sure we put the mechanisms in place, and we have a president who will sign those mechanisms in place to protect the American public for future administrations going forward. It's also the one area that we do have the opportunity for oversight is the General Accountability Office. The director of that organization has been very good, and they report to Congress. They have enhanced powers and enhanced resources to provide oversight of the CARES Act, which is a $2 trillion act. We got to have oversight for the American people to know that money is being spent the way Congress intended and that it's being done appropriately. That language that's actually in the CARES Act for the General Accountability Office is also language that I wrote. And in that case, we did it on a bipartisan basis. I worked with Ron Johnson, who is the chair of the committee, and he is a very conservative guy. Not can be, he is a very conservative guy, but he does believe in having an oversight. And to his credit, the administration pushed back pretty aggressively on the language that we wrote, but because we were able to have a bipartisan front, we were able to get it in the law. I'm going to keep working to make that happen when it comes to the IG question, that we have greater oversight. So I'm not giving up on it. But it is critically important that we get it done.
Thank you very much, Senator. Next question. What sort of laws do you believe Congress should adopt to help make the November 2020 election both more secure and more accessible?
Well, I think what's critically important is the vote by mail is extremely important. You want to make secure. Having a paper trail is always really good in an election. In fact, part of our election security measures is that we would have a paper trail in case there's some sort of cyber manipulation that could damage the integrity of the election. And fundamental to that is a paper trail, which you get with a vote by mail or no reason absentee vote, basically. We know it is secure. We know that it is also more convenient for voters, so you can expand the number of people who are able to vote. We also know there's strong popular support, as we saw in 2018, with a very strong majority of people voting to see that happen in Michigan, which is why it's so outrageous that we have a president who's now threatening us. He's threatening Michigan by going forward with a vote by mail, no reason absentee, and calling out our Secretary of State. And all she is doing is sending out applications for people that, do you want to vote by mail? It's up to voters to exercise that right, a fundamental right to vote. That is clearly, I think it's a great way anytime, no matter what situation we're in. And a number of states, as you know, already have vote by mail, have had no problems. They've increased their voter turnout. It's been a win-win. But it's particularly important when we continue to face potential cyber threats from adversaries like the Russians. But most importantly, right now, a pandemic. We don't want to see in Michigan. We don't know where we're going to be in November. I have no idea. Hopefully, we're not going to be in a situation that we were in when we saw the lines in Wisconsin and people lined up to vote and putting themselves at risk. It shows the spirit of the American people and how strongly they believe in their right to vote, that they're willing to stand in those lines, even with that kind of potential personal risk. But it's incumbent on us to make sure that people can vote without putting themselves at risk. We have to make the system work better. And we're going to have better results. I mean, one thing about vote by mail and having the ballot at your kitchen table is that you can really review that ballot. And I think many of us sometimes walk into a voting booth and there's a couple things we hadn't really thought about, or a provision that was on there that we didn't really research. We're like, oh, shoot, I forgot to look at that. I knew it was on the ballot, but I forgot to to really do my homework, or I'm not really familiar with this judge or the probate judge contest, whatever it may be. If it's on your kitchen table, you have the opportunity to really look into the issues and make sure you're making a vote that you believe is right based on your values and what you want to have happen. So vote by mail is safe, it's secure, it's convenient, and you have more informed voters. To me, that's a win-win. And I may have mentioned it, but the fact that we have President Trump, who, as far as we know, nearly all the elections, he's voted by mail himself. So apparently it's really good for him. He just doesn't want every other American to have the same opportunity that he has, which of course is par for the course.
I agree. Thank you, Senator. Satish?
Yeah, so it's no coincidence that he is targeting and attacking Michigan. Just the importance of our state and importance of the Senator Peter's race. Thank you so much, Senator. You are the top Democrat on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which have jurisdiction over USPS, United States Postal Service. Kind of to tag the vote by mail question, what can Congress do to ensure that USPS will remain vibrant, fully functional during the coming election and beyond, as a matter of fact, despite the administration's efforts?
It is absolutely critical that we make sure the U.S. Postal Service continues to function. I think what we have seen with this administration and by their actions, and particularly from President Trump, that I think he'd like to privatize it and basically turn it over to some of his corporate buddies and not have a service that is critical to delivering mail in every nook and cranny of our country. Every address gets serviced by the Postal Service. The Postal Service is important for everybody, but it is particularly important for folks who are in rural communities who may not have the same kinds of services from some of the commercial providers. The U.S. Postal Service needs to stay strong and needs to be vibrant. You mentioned vote by mail. If we're going to vote by mail, it's really important that we have a mail service. So that's going to be critical to make sure it's in place. I have been working and continue to work pretty aggressively to keep the Postal Service solvent and get with the resources that they need to stay solvent. They've been impacted by this COVID crisis, like all businesses. Their first-class mail has already been dropping as a result of changes in the marketplace, but the first-class mail now has dropped dramatically. I think probably most folks, when you go to your mailbox, probably have noticed there's less mail coming in than normal, and a lot of the kind of mail that went out during prior to COVID is not happening now and won't change until the COVID crisis gets behind us. Package deliveries have gone up in the short run, which has been helpful to them as people buying things online. But we don't know how sustainable that is as you start opening an economy. So we're really concerned about the financial structure of the Postal Service. And one reason why they have a difficult path is that they are required by law to pre-fund all of their retiree health care all up front. There isn't any company in America that's required to do that. The federal government generally doesn't do that. And so it really puts a real financial burden on the Postal Service, and they need to have meaningful reforms put in place to make sure they're on sound financial footing. During the CARES Act, I actually negotiated the ability for the Postal Service to have access to a federal loan of $10 billion. That came forward because we were getting projections at that time that the Postal Service could be insolvent by September. Now, some of those projections have been pushed back a little bit, but it was important to have a loan authority to make sure that the Postal Service could get through the crisis. At that time, those projections said that a $10 billion loan would get them through March. But we have to have a long-term solution. We got to sit down and make sure that they have that. They're going to have some of their debt, I believe, is going to have to be restructured in order for them to continue to stay strong and vibrant. But I'm 100% committed to keeping the Postal Service solvent and providing critical services to Americans. But it's another reason why we have to have a new president and why we have to have the majority in the Senate. It's these critical issues, the folks that are standing behind us. And it's frustrating on the Postal Service even now in trying to get some of these reforms and some of the additional help, given the fact that I have a number of my colleagues in the Senate who represent very rural states. And those rural states really depend on the Postal Service more than most other areas. And yet they're unwilling to stand up to Donald Trump. And that's the problem with the Republican Senate. Republican senators, for whatever reason, usually, even if it's in the worst, not in the good interest of their state, seem to be afraid to stand up to Donald Trump.
Thank you so much, Senator. So the next question is really the existential topic of our generation. It's climate change. So what actions should the federal government take to address climate change?
Well, we have to be aggressive and understand we have to get to a carbon neutral environment. There's no question that climate change is one of the existential threats of our time. And I would hope, if I may step back, what we have to do, but just what I hope when it comes to the public, and the public opinion has changed just over in the last few years. I've seen that more and more folks are realizing the urgency of the situation that we have to deal with. When I ran in 2014, I ran a big part of that campaign was the need to address climate change. It was not as popular a position then than it is now, and I'm encouraged by the fact that more and more people realize that we have to take action and realize that time is not on our side. The pandemic, I think, has also hopefully really made people more aware that the United States is part of a broader world community, and that things that happen anywhere on the planet can have an impact on what we do here in this country, and that we have to approach these problems globally and understand that the United States has to be a leader in the solutions related to climate change, as opposed to retreating like President Trump did when we retreated from the Paris Accord. That's something that the United States should never do. We need to lean in and be the world leader on this issue. So we are working on legislation now. In fact, we're on legislation to instruct the EPA to put forward policies to be carbon neutral by 2050. I think we can be more aggressive than that as well as technology continues to move forward. But we have to take those actions. But again, that bill that we have in the Senate will not pass with the Republican majority in the Senate, which is why for us to deal with climate change, we have to win the Senate, we have to win the presidency in order to put in the kind of ambitious targets necessary to transform our economy. And I'll just say, and what I've always talked about, as we move towards renewable energy and moving to a carbon neutral environment, it's actually really good for jobs. It's about job creation. It's about driving an economy. These are jobs that are not outsourced to the Middle East to drill for oil. These are jobs that are in our local communities. It's retrofitting our buildings to make them more energy efficient, which are good paying skills jobs, from carpenters to folks in the skilled trades broadly. It's bringing in solar technology, wind energy. All of these types of renewable energy sources are good for jobs in America. So in my mind, as we deal with the threat of climate change, it actually presents an opportunity to really supercharge our economy in ways that create good paying middle class jobs as we transition away from fossil fuels. I'll just say too, the other thing that is really clear, and I actually did a hearing, a field hearing in addition to hearings in Washington, DC, a field hearing on a report that I put out from the Homeland Security Committee, because it's a Homeland Security issue and a government affairs issue in terms of taxpayer money, that if we don't address climate change, if we don't invest in addressing climate change, we're going to end up spending a whole lot more money. It's going to be a lot more expensive. And part of that deals with the natural disasters. With climate change, we know storms are going to be more severe. We know they're also going to increase in frequency. And I think just look to what happened, unfortunately, just a few days ago in Midland with a major rain event that then led to the failure of dams. I was up there Saturday and had a chance to tour the area and be in the town of Sanford that was just hit and rocked so hard. And the images, I'm sure you've seen images of them, but to walk around the streets and to see this town that was just hit with a wall of water as a result of the failure of the dam, and a dam that simply was not equipped and was not up to standards to deal with the kind of severe weather events that we're going to be experiencing in the future, means we have to make significant infrastructure investments across our country to make sure that we can deal with these major storm events that are going to continue to come, which is why we deal with climate change broadly. And at the same time we're dealing with that broadly, also make sure we're preparing our infrastructure to withstand increased natural disasters as a result of a changing climate. And if the climate continues to change even more dramatically, you're going to have a hard time out building resiliency you've got to be doing both.
Thank you, Senator Peters. I understand that you have to leave at 1:45, so we just have a few minutes left. We've gotten a number of questions from the audience too. I want to mention one. So there's one member's request that you make climate change a more central part of your campaign publicity. That's not really, that's a suggestion, not so much a question.
Yeah.
The question was, for the many people who have been made unemployed by the coronavirus pandemic and will not be able to get their jobs back in the foreseeable future, how can one help them, in addition to providing unemployment compensation, to find their way back into the workforce? What can the government do?
Well, it's a critical question, and jobs are likely to look different after the pandemic. Different sectors are going to be impacted. I'll just say the one thing that I focus on, and I think is absolutely essential, is that we spend more of our resources on skilled training to make sure that folks have the skills necessary to get the jobs of the future. And these are jobs that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree, don't require a 2-year degree, but require specialized training either in the skilled trades or in manufacturing. Manufacturing is changing dramatically, and I'm a strong believer, and it's demonstrated, particularly with new technologies, artificial intelligence, all of these new ways of engaging in precision manufacturing. We can bring a lot of that manufacturing back from China and from other countries to the United States. You just make sure that we have workers that are trained with the types of skills that they need in order to work with these new technologies to produce it in America. Even now, prior to the pandemic, as I traveled all across the state of Michigan, I do it every week. Many manufacturers said, we have jobs available right now for folks, we just don't have folks with the right skills. And so we need to make sure those skilled programs are available broadly throughout our state. If you look at what the federal government spends to support 4-year college education for folks versus what we spend to help folks in skilled training. Skilled training is just a fraction of what we do in 4-year programs. And if you think about our state, 30 to 40% of folks may go on to an advanced degree, but we have to be concerned about everybody in this country, including the 60% of our population that doesn't go on to get a 2-year or 4-year degree, but have incredible skills, have incredible opportunities to lead a good paying middle-class life. And in my mind, everybody's path is different, but everybody's opportunity should be the same at the beginning. And we've got to make a renewed focus on folks in skills training for the jobs of tomorrow, which oftentimes are jobs we're taking back from other places around the world and producing here in our country. It's got to be a coordinated effort to have American workers making these products. And that's why I've really engaged in the supply chain for critical drugs and medical supplies. And actually, I put out a report last year as well from Homeland Security that made the case that when you look at drugs, the fact that we are dependent on the precursors for drugs and the chemicals that go into all the drugs we use every day, over 80% of those come from China and parts of India, but primarily China. We are beholden to China for that. The Chinese manufacturing that's there. We have to bring that back. And I said in the report, I said, when there's a pandemic, and it was when there's a pandemic, the United States is going to be put in a very difficult position. Little did I know, just a few months after that report of mine, here we are in that situation. To me, medical supplies, drugs is about national security. These are life and death products that should be made here in America. And I'm on the Armed Services Committee. The supply chain, the industrial supply chain is a big part of our national security. And, you know, for example, we don't buy our US Navy warships from China. We make sure we have shipyards in America, including one right on the Wisconsin UP border that makes did make a littoral combat ship and will now make the Navy's new frigate. We make sure we have shipyards with American workers making those kinds of things. When it's the M1 Abrams tank that the U.S. Army uses, we're proud that the engineering and work happens in places like Michigan and Ohio, not in a foreign country. So when it comes to life-saving medicines and when it comes to life-saving medical supplies, those need to be in America, American manufacturing. We've got to make sure workers have the skills to make those, which we can do. We can make that happen, but we start reviving manufacturing. And for us in Michigan, as I've always said, when we talk about made in America, that has always been really good for Michigan, because whenever you're making something, you're probably making it in some form or another. We're making it here in Michigan because we know how to make stuff.
Thank you so much, Senator. I think we've reached the end of our time. I just want to let Chris Savage say the last couple words, if you have anything to say, Chris.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Senator Peters. We really appreciate you and your team reaching out to us and putting this together. Thanks to Eli and Satish for their moderating today. I just want to talk to all the people that are out there right now listening. As Senator Peters said, he's up against a candidate that, although he spent the last 2 years scrubbing the internet of his last campaign and hiding from the media and from voters, he's massively funded by people like the DeVos family and the Republicans in general. And it's not a for sure thing that, we're going to have the resources that we need to pull this off. So it's very important that all of us are making contributions to Senator Peters' campaign. You can go to petersformichigan.com and do that. We need to make sure he's got the resources that he needs to make sure that we hold this seat. And holding this seat is a critical part of us retaking the US Senate. So thank you all very much. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy. Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.